Right, okay, we'll get going, and a good morning and a warm welcome to you all to our webinar on current financial trends in the market. It would be difficult to think of a time where there is more uncertainty in the market and lack of clarity. As we enter the first day of our second lockdown, we have Brexit on the horizon, and there is no US president. So if we can provide even the smallest clues to reading the market and what may happen in the future, then I hope that will be helpful. If you have any questions during this webinar at any time, please put them into the chat box, and we will then have a Q&A at the end and hope to get through as many as possible. And any that we don't, we will respond to you afterwards. So please do ask as and when you feel the need. We will also be running a few polls during the webinar just to search out your thoughts and opinions on certain subjects as well. It's really broken into two. We have been asked on numerous occasions, more and more often by our clients, as to what's happening in the market and what we are seeing in the market. And that's due to, I think, a couple of reasons. One, to assess other organizations' business decision making. And also, I think, as recruitment is often seen as a bellwether to overall business confidence. And therefore, we will cover a couple of slides just on what we're seeing in the market and what activity is being shown to us. But then the main event will be Liz Martins, who will talk through in detail, I think, both on the global and UK side, the analysis and opinion and ideas that she has. We're very lucky to have Liz again. Liz is a senior economist at HSBC. She has presented to our clients several times, and it's always been hugely popular. And anyone who joined us for the May presentation that she did knows how useful and what clarity she provides to anyone who is having to make a decision making at the moment. I also think it's very brave for her to keep returning to a similar audience after she's presented what she thinks will happen before. Liz holds a bachelor's and master's degrees from Cambridge. She's been at HSBC since 2010, initially in their Dubai office during the turbulent period of the Arab Spring. She moved back to London in 2014, and since 2016, she has led HSBC's analysis of the UK economy, including the key task of navigating, obviously, the vote to leave the EU, which is still very much with us. So we could hardly have a better person to talk to and question and get their opinions from today. So thank you very much indeed, Liz, for once again lending us your time, particularly in such a busy week. So if we could have the first slide. I'd like to draw your attention firstly to the graph in the bottom left-hand side. And as you can see from that, since June, we have had a steady rise in permanent hiring and permanent recruitment. And this seems to have been down to several reasons. One is many departments, and particularly finance departments, have reduced their temporary headcount, mainly due to moral reasons for not feeling they should have temporary staff whilst permanent staff are on furlough, and also not wanting to hire temporary staff for the similar reasons. And therefore, as they've been incredibly busy during this time, they have been able to secure extra permanent headcount. This will also explain why our temporary placements and temporary recruitment has really continued to fall throughout. And we feel that's directly connected to furlough. And in October, which this graph doesn't cover, we did see that stabilize and begin to rise, obviously falling in line with furlough ending and people feeling more comfortable bringing in temporary hires. That is a bit counterintuitive in a downturn for temporary hiring to reduce and permanent hiring to go up, but we feel that is down to the extraordinary circumstances of a furlough scheme. Equally, I think temporary recruitment has been affected by people's fear of the time taken to onboard them in a remote basis when they're only going to be there for a particular time. Secondly, a lot of companies have taken this as an opportunity to upskill. There are higher levels of quality candidates available at the moment, and they're looking to make the most of that. And also that's combined to the fact that, as always, many companies have used this crisis as an opportunity to cut lower performers and therefore upskill those particular positions. Thirdly, unfortunately, some organisations haven't managed lockdown particularly effectively. They haven't managed the furlough particularly effectively. The communication's not been very good. And some people have already begun to vote with their feet in regards to how they feel that was managed by their organisation. And lastly, restructures and reorganisations that most companies have been through during this period does always produce some skill gaps which needs to be filled. If you look at the top box, where are people hiring? Then it seems to be mid-level hires is the most popular. I would talk about sort of 50 to 55,000 to 60 to 65,000 pound salary areas. Equally, director level has been much more resilient and come back quicker than we would have anticipated too. Why? Well, we feel this level probably, when you can't hire many people, is going to make the most amount of difference to your department. They can work independently and will be better at working independently. And most of them have the infrastructures to be set up from home and onboarded much more easily. From a regional basis, for us, the Southwest has come back quickest, probably followed by the Midlands and then the North and then the home counties. But London undoubtedly has been the slowest market out of the first lockdown. It does seem to have picked up its skirts since October, which is a good sign. And whilst very, very early days, and it's only 3 days since the second lockdown was announced, so far activity has remained at the same level. It seems to have made little difference. People seem to be shrugging off the second lockdown, and the momentum continues, but it is extremely early days. Sector-wise, very few surprises here. Travel, leisure, hospitality are the worst hit and show the least signs of recovery. Our most resilient 3 sectors were pharmaceutical and life sciences, which would be of no surprise, then public sector, but really talking about government and local government hiring, and then technology and telecoms. And our fastest returners have been property, business services and professional services, but that also is a good list outside travel and leisure of those who were the most badly hit during the last lockdown and therefore have been recovering the quickest. In terms of what people are looking for when they're hiring, again, I don't think there are any major surprises here. Surveys that we have shown that adaptability, and that's the able to adjust processes and procedures. Flexible leadership. I think everyone in any leadership roles knows that, as well as all the other skills they've added counsellor, entertainment manager, and many others to their CV. But for us, what we are seeing a lot more is the need for, or the requirement or request for empathy in people who are going to be in leadership roles that is now coming through very strongly. And lastly, stakeholder management. But actually what that really means is effective communicator. If we look at the candidate side on the next slide, then there is no doubt that the disruption has certainly caused uncertainty and thoughts around change. We have seen people in the hospitality sector deciding to move right now. They feel their skills are enough, that they can get out of that sector as quickly as they can. But also, I think people, as I've said, are judging their organization on how they've managed the processes of the pandemic so far. However, I would add that in 2019, LinkedIn quoted that they felt 74% of employees were always open to opportunities. So if 70% now are reassessing their career options, it may not be as big a change as we would think. However, there is a definite shift towards safety. Non-client facing roles are seen as safer because they are less target orientated. And there's a move to more socially positive or public service roles. In fact, at Page in June, we had 3 people leave us to join the police force and 1 join to become a nurse. I haven't seen that at any time in my 20 years previously. So we've seen that in action as well. And actually, McKinsey's in their September roundup said that the pandemic has forced a reckoning between the profit motive and a company's social purpose. So this has very much brought that onto the agenda. And lastly, what we're seeing is that looking to the future, candidates are assessing how well their organisation is set up for hybrid working. And by that, they're meaning the culture for hybrid working. Is it seen as acceptable? And whether things like training and therefore their development can still happen if they are working remotely. And those that are seeing that hybrid working is going to be difficult within the way their organization works are undoubtedly looking for organizations who will suit their needs better. So just a very, very quick roundup of what we're seeing in the market and how the market has been changing for us. Now, before I go on to the main event, which is Liz, we have our first poll. So we're talking of uncertainty at the moment. So we wanted to ask you who you think will be the US president in February 2021. Maybe we should have added whether it will be decided by then. So please select whether you think either Donald Trump or Joe Biden in the end will be successful to be the US president in February. By February 2021, will be the next president of the United States. Just click one of those and our results will come through almost immediately. I know for me, yesterday morning, I felt it was Donald Trump. By lunchtime, I thought it's Joe Biden, and then I changed my mind again. So I think probably following from what the press has said, 88% think Joe Biden. So if I hand over to Liz and ask Liz, does that surprise you particularly, and would that have much of a difference to us whether it's one or the other?
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Well, I mean, I guess things do change very quickly, don't they? And as you say, it has become clear over the last sort of 12 hours or so that clearly Joe Biden is in the lead, but Donald Trump is not happy about it. So it ain't over till it's over, is it? But very interesting times. In terms of the impact on the UK, I think you've got two very different characters there at a time when the UK is looking to get a trade deal post Brexit. So, obviously, the UK, Boris Johnson has had a very good relationship with Donald Trump. There's been some very entertaining articles in the press about the UK scrambling to get in touch with the Biden camp because we've put all our eggs in the Trump basket, and the worry is that the UK will be penalised for that in a Biden presidency. I think in reality there won't be much of a penalty to be paid, but it will make for a very different character in negotiations. So very, very interesting times for sure. Moving on from that, I guess, and if we can bring up maybe my title slide, I'm glad that I'm not the only one who has to ask for my slides to be moved. Even Chris Whitty at the PM's press conferences has to get somebody to press the button for him. But yeah, this is a presentation which I'm afraid I've titled Cold Winter Setting In. For those of you who heard me in May, I think the jury was very much out at that point, and it did feel like maybe there could be a strong rebound, a quick bounce back, and a return to normality. Because as I was fond of saying at that time, it wasn't just any recession. It was essentially the government switching the economy off and switching it back on again, which is very different to a traditional recession and should point to an ability to bounce back quickly. I'll come to how we've gone on that. We actually did have a pretty good summer, and Jonathan's alluded to some better news in the labour market, but as you can tell by the title of this slide, I have to admit to you all that I feel more depressed than I did back in May, and I fear my presentation may have the same impact on you. It does feel to me as though, one massive hit is one thing, but then the same thing happening 6 months later is quite another. So I think we do have plenty to worry about, but it's always best to come prepared. So hopefully you'll forgive me for being too depressing. And before I get onto the UK and our depressing outlook, I thought I'd start on actually some of the interesting things from around the world. So if I can move on to my first slide. This is economists have been forced to look at all kinds of different data. We no longer look at exports and imports and industrial production and all of that stuff. We now look at Google mobility data, the data that Google takes from you when you move around while having the Google Maps app on your phone. And I just wanted to bring this global picture of contrasts to you. So right over there on the left, you've got New Zealand, which is actually sees movement up on last year, and then a spectrum of different performances all the way over to the right hand side, where Philippines and Argentina are having one of the worst COVID experiences and continue to see movement in these kind of retail and recreation spaces, bars, restaurants, gyms, theme parks, that kind of thing, well down on previous levels. So I've given you kind of a snapshot there in terms of countries in the three most recent months. But if we move on to my next slide, you can see it more kind of over time. And this is just broken down by continent, and you can see the big drop off in movement in April. And you can then see quite a good rebound. You know, it's that V-shaped recovery we talked about to all intents and purposes into the summer, but we never get back to zero. So we never get back to full capacity or where we were pre-crisis. And at that point, we start to stall. And you see that across Asia, which started this experience first, and you see it in Europe. In fact, Europe gets closest to zero, closest to the baseline, but then starts to fall away again. And unfortunately, as the virus becomes more prevalent, the more I think that continues. And on the next slide, as Jonathan highlighted some very interesting points about the labour market, and it is one of the most interesting features of this whole COVID experience. So far, the general picture is that even where activity has improved, companies are still cutting jobs. So this is the PMI survey, and it's quite a simple survey. It just says to people, did you produce more or less this month? So of course, in September, a majority of companies in many countries said, yes, we produced more in September than in August. We're continuing to recover in that sense. But did you hire more or less people, or is your headcount higher or lower? And nearly all of those numbers are below the 50 bar, showing that headcount contracted. So it's a kind of jobless recovery so far. And it may, unfortunately, mean that companies are squeezing more productivity out of fewer people. So they've let people go and they're not bringing them back because actually you can get more out of less. The next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the permanent changes that we might get from COVID-19. And of course, working from home is one of those. I'll talk about the impact on our cities, which has been really quite profound. But working from home has been a major change, and one that it feels like isn't going to go away. I think one of Jonathan's slides had 3 out of 5 people saying they wanted to work from home permanently, and I certainly know that myself and my colleagues have felt the benefits of working from home a lot. And one of the things about COVID-19, I suppose, why economies have held up relatively well and we've been relatively resilient and we've been able to have that V-shaped bounce back, is because it has happened at a point in time when our technology has been really quite good, so that we can do this event on Zoom or on GoTo rather. We can talk to each other. I can put my slides together from my living room, and then I can send them off to be produced and formatted, and then we can put them to you, via all our home Wi-Fi networks. Had it happened even 5 years ago, the situation would have been very different, and all that activity might have gone to waste. So it is very different, but different countries have different experiences of that, and different levels of readiness. What's interesting on this chart is basically this is 2018, before any of us had heard of the virus, and this is who was working from home at that point. As you might expect, countries with high technological penetration, UK, Denmark, Sweden, had the highest number of people, and then you see somewhere like Italy had one of the lowest, number of people working in Europe, and we've seen that in activity in cities. The Italians, when the lockdown restrictions were lifted, went back to their offices much more than we did here in the UK, because they were able to do less from home, or culturally less accustomed to working from home. And it does make a major difference to activity in cities, as I will come on to. Another trend on the next slide, which has been accelerated by COVID-19, is the end of cash, or certainly the gradual demise of cash usage. So this is cash withdrawals in 2019 and 2020. Of course, in 2020, not only did we go out and spend a lot less in physical establishments, but actually most of those physical establishments wouldn't accept cash because it might be harboring germs of the virus. So you can see this massive drop, and if everybody's got used to paying for things on their phone, with a card, via PayPal, because they're buying more online or whatever, it feels like that might mean that this drop in cash usage is permanent. Another trend, if we move on to the next slide, has been internet and online retail, which of course was massively increasing anyway, but even by infrequent e-commerce users, so maybe people who are less accustomed to technology, older people, you can see the current amount that they are purchasing online compared to the prior amount, so the red bars compared to the black bars, much higher, and most people expecting to buy even more online in future. So very interesting times in terms of retail. Frightening if you are a physical retailer, especially a small one, especially one in a city centre, but clearly something that is going absolutely nowhere and will continue to accelerate, and has been accelerated by the virus. The next slide, not to pick on Italy again, but just to say that there are cultural differences between different countries, and somewhere like the UK, where we do have high penetration of online retail and online usage, is going to make that transition much more quickly than somewhere like Spain and Italy, where older people are much less likely to use the internet for their transactions. So that was kind of the interesting bit of my presentation, the kind of long-term interesting trends that may change, and now I'm afraid I'm going to get to the slightly depressing bit on the UK. So we'll move on to the next slide, actually, and I think we're going to start now with another poll question. So please, fingers on your keypads. I wanted to start, before I get to the material of it, to ask you this question, which is a very contentious issue. And it goes like this: the UK government's latest nationwide lockdown is A, a regrettable necessity, B, a dangerous gamble, the costs will outweigh the benefits, or C, I don't know, I'm just glad I'm not the one making the decision. So please cast your votes now, and we'll see what you all think.
I think, Liz, we might not know how this would come out for the Conservative Party, never mind across our audience.
Absolutely, absolutely. Such a dividing issue, isn't it? And I know they had the vote the other day, and even our former Prime Minister, Theresa May, abstained from that vote. So, I mean, there's very strong feeling on both sides. And I think it's interesting because, you know, once upon a time, or rather, I should say, the first quarter of the year, you know, everybody was very much on board, but there's much more resistance to it this time round. And here are our results. 65% a regrettable necessity, 30% a dangerous gamble, and 5% saying don't know. I have to say, I'd be in that 5%. I really don't know. I can see such big costs in terms of the lockdown, and the social consequences, and the consequences for other areas of healthcare, and the consequences for the economy. But at the same time, it is, of course, a regrettable necessity to stop the virus from spreading. So it is really, it's a really tough question, and I think probably that split probably roughly represents the population. But you know, if 30% of our population think it is a dangerous gamble and don't want to comply, then that may have some repercussions for how the restrictions, how effective the restrictions are. So let's move on to my first UK slide then, and I do have some good news in here because you know, as I said, the summertime has been not too bad really. We've had a pretty decent return from the first lockdown. So the Google, I mean, the two main areas I think where the recovery's been really good. One is on the housing market and one is on retail sales. So left-hand side, what do you do when you're thinking about buying a house? First thing you do is you Google Rightmove and mortgage calculator, find out how much you can borrow and repay, and start looking at houses. And those Google searches you can see crash through the floor and then you know, bounce back. The retail sales chart on the right-hand side, I think, is a perfect V-shape. And we talked a lot about V-shaped recoveries. There is a beautiful V-shaped recovery for you. Now, we're buying things differently, as I pointed out earlier. We're buying more online. We're buying more food and alcohol in the supermarket as opposed to out in bars and restaurants. But nonetheless, we are, you know, the purchases, the volume of purchases in August and September was higher in 2020 than in 2019, which is pretty impressive considering we've just had the worst recession in 300 years. But I wanted to dwell a little on the housing market, which is always a popular topic. And this is the RICS survey of new buyer inquiries. And you can see, again, it crashes through the floor in the early part of lockdown and then points skywards through the summer. And all the anecdotal evidence points to a really strong housing market. The mortgage approvals in September, I think, were a post-global financial crisis high, 91,000. And you can see from this chart that new buyer interest was really strong. I think three reasons for this. One is that there was pent-up demand. So anybody who was thinking about moving in February, March, April or May probably didn't get to do it. So that all that demand came flooding out at once when the restrictions were lifted. The second, which I allude to in the title of this slide, Rishi Sunak came and cut stamp duty a long way, which you know, does make a real difference to the transactional cost of buying a house, particularly if you put a deadline on it, which is in this case the end of March. And the third reason, I think, is because while we were in lockdown the first time, we all had a good long think about our lives and what we wanted and what we want from our homes and what we want from our lifestyles. And many people decided, well, hold on, I'm not commuting into Canary Wharf. I don't need to be 45 minutes away from Canary Wharf anymore, but I do need more space, more outside area, more fresh air, a different lifestyle. And I think that is probably one of the major drivers. Because it is unusual to have a major recession followed by a housing market boom, but it's not just us here in the UK that's seen it. Other countries around the world have seen similar trends. But what's really interesting, if I go to my next slide, is that you can see that impact in the regional breakdown, because London has had by far the weakest price growth and activity levels of any region. And it goes to what you were saying at the beginning, Jonathan. You know, London activity is being held back because London is a commuter city. I haven't put the chart in this, but there's also a chart of open table restaurant bookings, and that shows again London way below, in terms of recovery, way below the national average. So London, having been the leader, the outperformer, the centre of excellence for so long, is absolutely not bottom of the class in terms of its recovery from the pandemic. Now, if I move to my next slide, as another beautiful V-shape in the PMI chart on the left, both manufacturing and services, we saw a very good bounce in terms of activity growth. But the V-shape on the right is much more faltering and uncertain. And actually on the employment side, again, when you ask companies, did your headcount go up or down? You know, we never get back above 50, indicating growth. So it looks like, again, that story of the jobless recovery. You know, activity bounces back, but employment really doesn't. And if we move to the next slide, you know, this has to be a worry as we go forward. The headline rate of unemployment hasn't been too bad. We've gone from 3.9% to 4.5%. But here are some quite worrying charts. The claimant count level. So even if you're technically employed, but you're claiming universal credit to boost your income, you're counted in that line, which has spiked. And then number of vacancies. Obviously there is a V in that chart, but you have to get your magnifying glass out to look for it. It's only a very small bounce there. Sadly, I think things may, as Jonathan said, may have been getting better in September and October, but here we are with our new lockdown, which might make a real difference there. The next slide, I think, is an interesting point, which some people, in quite a callous way, would somewhat celebrate. So, and that is to say that the hit to employment has been mostly felt by the young people. You can see it in the chart on the left in the US, and you can see it in the chart on the right in the UK. Now, some people might argue, well, this is quite good news for the wider economy, because these young people don't have a mortgage, so they're not going to affect the wider housing market. They don't have much disposable income, so they're not going to, whether they're spending or not won't make much difference to the broader economy. I would really disagree with that. One, because I think it's too optimistic to think that the burden of the biggest recession in 300 years can be or should be isolated to one generation. And two, because I think, young people may not have a mortgage, but they may have a credit card. They may have parents that they have to lean on. They do rent flats, even if they don't buy their home. So there will be a knock-on impact from a massive hit to young people's employment. And apart from that, it may only have been phase one that was the young people who work as in hospitality, etc. If we go to the next slide, this is some interesting data which suggests that actually it's white-collar jobs postings that have fallen the hardest and that have the highest application per vacancy ratio. So actually it's unlikely that we can expect this this impact simply to be borne by the young people. Now, if we move on, I've got another question for you, because I am somebody who has to forecast unemployment, so I'm interested to know from you what your plans are for your own businesses, or what your business's plans are, all completely anonymous, but thinking about your own business. What are your plans for headcount, large scale cuts, small scale cuts, or are you hiring?
So Liz, what would your expectation be for this?
I mean, my expectation would be that it's mostly large or small scale cuts. I hope to be surprised positively, but I think a lot of businesses, have done their best to muddle through, a very difficult year, but coming into another slowdown, whether you're affected by the lockdown directly, or whether you're affected by lower confidence, or whether you're affected by Brexit worries, I think, generally speaking, unfortunately, the news is on cuts to employment, but we shall see.
I suppose our hope a little bit was that people would have made these decisions around the end of furlough, and if they may have cut deeper, as often people do, so they may have got to that position for the future, but maybe now the future is worse than they thought it was going to be.
Well, there you go. You're the expert, Jonathan, and the survey proves you absolutely right. Only 11% planning large-scale cuts, 42 small-scale cuts, but 47. So the most popular response being we are hiring, and that's really heartening to know. And I certainly hope that my depressing presentation doesn't put anyone off from that optimistic outlook. But let's move to the next slide.
Or we're all deluded. Or we're all deluded.
It's unlikely. I'm sure we've got some very undeluded people on the call. But look, I will plow ahead with my depressing story with the hopes that you'll all not become too downhearted. But here's the chart of some of the COVID numbers lately, and I know that I'm an optimist. I was hoping that this second wave wouldn't materialize. I was one of those people who was saying, we haven't got that many new cases, they're not translating into higher deaths. Unfortunately, the numbers do prove that is not the case. We had 492 deaths in the UK yesterday, from COVID-19. You can see the hospital admissions, the ventilator usage on the chart on the left. It is a, you know, as I think 60% of people said earlier, you know, an unpalatable necessity that we have this slowdown. But unfortunately, as the second chart, if we move on to the next chart, shows, the economy was actually already slowing. I don't know whether actually this chart goes to August, and I don't know whether, maybe from what you're saying, Jonathan, as well, September and October were a bit better. But August, I thought, was surprisingly weak. And you can see the GDP growth on the left-hand side. I expected August to be really strong. We had great weather. We had Eat Out to Help Out. We had everybody on a staycation. We had, you know, the restrictions at their loosest that they've been since the crisis began. And even so, you can see that we only got a small amount of growth for August. And that worries me for the remainder of the year, given that we now have the lockdown. We also have a little thing called Brexit. So the next slide is just Boris Johnson threatening to walk away from talks on the 16th of October. I think it was all of 4 days later that the talks resumed. And despite these strong words, we do think that there will be a deal. But, you know, our view is that the deal won't be enough to prevent some near-term disruption. And actually, we've heard from the Bank of England this morning, and they're saying very much the same thing. They're saying the deal might be great, but a lot of businesses are not prepared, and actually the disruption in the first quarter they think is going to take 1% off UK GDP. If we move to the next slide, there's a lot of words on here and I don't expect you to read them all. It's a timeline of how far we've come on Brexit, and I just wanted to mention, because we first published on Brexit in 2015, February 2015. So that's how long I've been wrangling with, you know, soft Brexits, hard Brexits, trade deals, customs unions, all of that stuff. And when we published that report, we think that was the first time anyone used the phrase soft Brexit or hard Brexit in print. And when we coined those terms and we laid out our definition, we would absolutely have designated the deal that is now on the table as a hard Brexit. We're out of the customs union. We're out of the single market. There's nothing in there so far on services. This feels like a really hard Brexit. It's not a no deal, but it's a pretty hard Brexit nonetheless. So if we move on to the next slide, you know, no deal does certainly make a difference, and this is the difference it makes. It is, of course, the introduction of tariffs, and these are some of the rates. Most notably, it's cars and agriculture where it really hurts trade on both sides. But as I say, we do expect a deal to be done. There's a lot of bluster. You periodically hear Barnier and Frost saying how badly it's all going, and flouts off from talks from time to time. But our expectation remains that there will be a deal done by the end of the year. There won't be tariffs, but it can still be quite disruptive. There's still a bit of work to be done, though. The next slide is around the Japan deal that we heard a lot about. I think it was last week or the week before. You can see that it's a nice to have. In terms of the impact on UK GDP, it's 0.07%. Remember, I said that the Bank of England expects Brexit disruption alone to take 1% off GDP in the first quarter. So 0.07% over 15 years is not very much at all. But it does have some positives for trade in terms of the numbers on the right-hand side. So that is good news. But we have to put the Japan deal into context. So the pie on the left is all of the countries that the UK trades with. Half of it is the EU. The red and the dark red bars, that's countries where we have a trade deal as an EU member. So we need to redo those trade deals so that they still apply. So Japan is in that 10% that we've completed. The dark red we still need to do, Canada, Turkey, and a few others. And then that pinky bit, the 34%, that's the exciting part. That's the parts of the world that we didn't have a trade deal with as an EU member, and which we can now go out and do trade deals with. And that's where the growth potential lies. Australia, New Zealand, the US, maybe even China one day. You know, that's where the UK hopes to see some upside from Brexit. So I've presented a pretty depressing picture of the UK and global economies. So the next question is, what do our policymakers do about it? And this slide is it's actually out of date already as of 3 hours ago, because it contains our forecast for what the BOE was going to do today. We thought they would increase their asset purchase target to £845 billion. They've gone a step further and they've done another £150 billion of QE this morning. And that takes asset purchases to £895 billion. It's an eye-watering amount. It's well over a third of the UK economy that the BOE will own in UK debt by the end of the year. It's quite a meaningful amount, and there are many questions over what this all means for the long term. The fact that the BOE is hoovering up all this money, the debt that the government is issuing, in order to keep yields low and keep monetary conditions easy, and there's a question for the long term, I think. But there's another question, which is that if that's what you're doing now, what are you going to do if things get really bad? And the BOE is forecasting a pretty good bounce in GDP next year. So the question is, if they are wrong, what do they do next? And if we move on to our next slide, I'm sure we've all seen increasingly the talk about negative rates, and they're very much on the table in our view. It's not our current forecast, but you never want to rule this out. And the Bank of England told us in August that that negative rates are a tool in the toolkit. Now, the chart on the right-hand side shows you how contentious negative rates would be. This is just the percentage of people who think lower interest rates have made them worse off. Essentially, nobody feels better off as a consequence of lower interest rates, and nobody much fancies the idea of negative rates. In reality, we're not going to be paying the banks to look after our deposits and our savings. That's not the experience of other countries that have done negative rates. Of course, Japan, Sweden, Switzerland, the European Central Bank has negative rates. The New Zealanders are preparing to bring in negative rates, and none of them really have passed it on to deposit holders or current accounts. But it does mean that the banks will get hit because they can't make any money charging people on their deposits, but they're forced to lend at ever lower interest rates, which means that at some point they're not making any money on lending at all. So at some point it becomes a counterproductive policy, and that is the contentious debate that the Bank of England has to have with itself in deciding whether this is going to happen. But they've sent out a letter to the banks telling them, essentially asking them, how prepared are you for a bank rate of zero or of lower than zero? And that has sent the signal to a lot of people that they are going to do it, and certainly the market is expecting them to do it. So although we're not currently forecasting it, I think the door is absolutely open if things are worse than they expect, and 2021 proves a harder year than they expect. So let's see what you think. Let's move on to our final question. In 2 years' time, where will the BOE's bank rate? At the moment, it's 0.1%. It was kept on hold this morning. But in 2 years' time, where will we be? Below zero, 0 to 1%, so essentially unchanged, or higher than 1%? Let us know what you think. And there's the results. So, okay, just 5% of you think they're going below zero, or if you think they're going below zero, you don't think they're staying there for 2 years. Most of you think they'll be unchanged where they are, and 24% of you think they'll be higher. Very interesting. I mean, as I say, our central case, our current forecast is that they stay where they are. So we'd be with the 71%. But I'd probably put not that it reads like this, but I'd probably put a bit of a higher chance than 5% than they go below zero. So very interesting. Right, we are running out of time, so let me rush through my final 3 slides. The next one is simply just where we are on fiscal policy. So I talked about monetary policy. We've done all that QE. We might see rate cuts. Fiscal policy. We'll hear from Rishi Sunak yet again. This is what borrowing has already done on his watch. The orange line is the gradual increase in borrowing last fiscal year. The black line is what borrowing has done in the current fiscal year. In the first 6 months, we've already borrowed 4 times what we borrowed in the whole of the previous year. So quite clearly, borrowing has massively increased with the job retention scheme, with the deferred tax, with lower revenues, with the business grants, with the self-employment support, with the universal credit. The measures have been incredibly generous. They add up to, I think, £210 billion and counting, and we'll probably hear from the Chancellor that there's going to be even more coming through today. But if I bring up my next slide, this doesn't make for nice reading at all for the government, because the more they borrow and spend, the less popular they become. And you can see their popularity ratings have only fallen steadily since the first lockdown began. And now I'll just finish off by bringing up the final slide, which just has something on the consequences of that falling approval. Nigel Farage says he's going to come back. He is going to rename the Brexit Party as the Reform UK Party, and this party will campaign against lockdown measures. So really difficult times, I think, globally with the economic consequences of COVID-19. You see the unrest in the US right now over the election. I'm not suggesting we're going to have rioting on our streets in the UK, but certainly never underestimate the ability of Nigel Farage to influence UK politics, to tap into unrest and unhappiness among the population. And as things get harder, then things could certainly get much more complicated for our government, which I have to say just means that they are probably likely to keep on spending money, despite the fact the Chancellor said at the Conservative Party conference 4 weeks ago that the Conservative Party will always balance the books and has a sacred duty to do so. I have to say, if you put together those approval charts we've just looked at, Keir Starmer starting to pull ahead in the polls and Nigel Farage nipping at the heels from the other side, it feels like the government is under a lot of pressure and will have to keep on spending to keep us all happy. Right, that's all my slides. So if we move on, we will be ready, I think, to take some questions and answers. And I have spoken for far too long, but I think we've still got at least 10 minutes, Jonathan.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for that, Liz. And just to say, obviously, there's a lot of information, a lot of charts there. We have recorded this, and obviously we do have the presentation as well. So if you would like a copy of that, then please do come to us and we will send one through to you. So I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions, if that's all right, Liz.
Absolutely.
So I'll try and make them across the range of I suppose, uncertainties that there are at the moment. First question is, what has the experience been in countries that have moved to negative rates? Has there been an improvement in GDP, for example?
Very interesting question. I'd have to say not really on the evidence, but of course, what you can never do is you can never say with the counterfactual. So you can never say, what would GDP have done if I hadn't had negative rates? Would it have been even lower? So you can find a lot of supporting evidence for negative interest rates, including in Europe, where the banks obviously hate it because it hurts their margins, but they do say begrudgingly that growth was probably higher as a consequence of negative rates. So there is some evidence, but what I find really telling is the Swedish experience. So Sweden had rates down all the way as far as, I think it was minus 1.5% at times. And then they gradually raised rates through last year, so that at the end of the year, they got back to zero. And then when COVID-19 hit, they didn't cut back into negative territory. And for me, that is so telling, because no crisis could really have been worse than the one we've just been through. And yet they didn't see negative rates as the answer. In fact, the Swedish experience is that negative rates gave them a housing bubble, which you could certainly see being a possible consequence in the UK as well. So I'd say there's mixed evidence. Our view is that they're not particularly effective at raising growth and inflation, which is what they're designed to do. But central banks feel they have to keep doing something. And when you're at 0.1% already, the only way to do more is to go negative. So it's a very contentious question, and one we don't have the answer to. But certainly there's mixed evidence, and some people would argue in favour.
Thank you. And in May, obviously, there were some fairly worrying views around where unemployment had gone in certain countries. And obviously, the furlough scheme was put together to avoid that. Are you now anticipating large unemployment coming our way in the next 3 to 6 months?
Relatively large, but not as large as we had been. So my initial expectation was that unemployment would be much higher than it has come in at. So the most recent number we have is 4.5% for August, which I know we had the furlough scheme. I know a lot of people were still furloughed in August, but I still think it's remarkable that the rise was contained to that. If we look at other countries, unemployment did spike much higher. So I've revised down my forecast so that from 4.5%, I now have the forecast of 5.5% by the end of the year. It's still a rise, but it's not. I had 7.2% originally. Yeah. The Bank of England had 7.5%. They've revised down today to 6.3%. So, I mean, we're all looking for a rise. It's just how far, I guess, the Chancellor, the fiscal intervention prevents that rise from being as bad as it could be. And that's really the main risk. I mean, obviously, the virus, the extent of the lockdown, whether we're going to be locked down again next year, that all plays into it. But also, how much is the government prepared to spend to make sure we don't get to too painful levels? And as I said, the political implications for them, my slides at the end, their approval, the fact that Nigel Farage is out there, suggests that they will have to keep spending.
Thank you. And what do you believe has been the main driver behind the house price rises, and do you think it will continue?
Yeah, I think, as I said, it's pent-up demand is one thing. I think Rishi Sunak's stamp duty cut is another, and then I just think it's everybody moving out of small flats in cities and into houses in regions where they can afford more square footage for their money, and also most crucially some outside space, having all been cooped up for 3 months. Many people in flats without outside space in cities, they're looking for something different. So I think it's very interesting, but it is something that we've seen globally as well. Low interest rates, of course, play into that as well. Low interest rates and some forced saving as well, because of course when we were all locked down in March, April, May, we weren't going out and spending money. We didn't go on holiday. We didn't go to restaurants. Maybe our gym subscription was cancelled, etc. So if you're lucky enough to still be in employment, even if you're only on 80% of your wage, chances are you manage to save a bit of money. So I think that probably plays into it as well. And as we all know, there's it's pretty hard work to get any interest on your savings, and yet low interest rates mean mortgage borrowing is cheap. So put it all together, and a lot of people came to the conclusion it was time to move on.
Yeah, interesting. And I suppose a bit of clarification here. Someone's asking, you seem to be saying that I think with all that's going on with the pandemic and the lockdowns, etc., people are not getting prepared enough for what is a hard Brexit deal and will probably have more disruption than people are anticipating. Is that right?
Kind of. I mean, the question kind of implies that I would blame people for not getting ready, which is not the case. I think it's very hard to get ready when we don't have the deal yet, and we don't know what the new rules are going to be. The government hasn't left very much time at all to tell people what the new situation is going to be and allow them to prepare for it. So for those in the affected sectors, anyone who exports or imports to the EU, anyone in manufacturing, there will be an impact, and I think companies have done their best to prepare as much as possible, but I think there's still some uncertainty around what they're supposed to be preparing for, and as we know, when you make big changes, sometimes you don't see you don't necessarily anticipate all of the obstacles that arise until you're in the situation, and we may see that happen. As I say, the Bank of England today it is saying it will take 1% off UK GDP in Q1, and I think that sounds reasonable. And I think earlier in the year the government was kind of saying, well, we've got COVID, it's so bad already. It's kind of almost the perfect time to have a big disruptive trade event because the economy is in such a bad place already, we'll hardly notice another hit. But I think that's not true. I actually think if we look at COVID-19, it's mainly affected services, hospitality, whereas Brexit would mainly affect manufacturing and export. So what you don't really want to do is, when you've had a sector that's been hit hard already, is take another sector that's been less affected and give that a whack from a different angle. So I do worry about the impact at the end of the year, of the end of the transition period, and I do think probably we're not prepared, but I certainly wouldn't, put that on any companies. I think it's very hard to be prepared.
Okay. But actually, people need to be getting onto that deal as soon as it comes out, because it will be more dramatic than maybe we felt it would be.
Yeah, I think quite possibly. Yeah.
Okay. And last final question as we come to the end of the hour. You spoke about the fact that you were an optimist and knew that there could be a second lockdown, but were working on the basis that it might not happen. Going forward, do you anticipate that we're now into a world of intermittent lockdowns going forward? So there could be a third after this one at some stage. Is that a world that you think we should be working towards?
Yeah, I think probably that's the worst case scenario that we should be taking into account. I'm probably still in the same position. I'm still an optimist that hopes that won't be the case. But having learnt my lesson, I think maybe we should be looking towards that. I mean, ultimately, until there's a vaccine, it does feel like you can box everybody away and control the virus for a while. Very good evidence coming out of Ireland at the moment for that. They implemented their lockdown a couple of weeks before we did, and having some very good results already, while keeping the schools open. So that's good news. But what's going to happen when you reopen? The worry is that you go through the whole cycle again, and until there's a vaccine, we keep doing it, hard as it seems to believe. And I think every time it happens, the less resilient companies are going to be. If you've taken another big loan, you've let a few more people go, you've run down your reserves a little bit, it's hard, isn't it? It's hard to keep taking these big shocks. And I suppose, in terms of a rebound, you need investor confidence and business confidence. And as long as we're anticipating more lockdowns, it's going to be hard for that to come back.
Absolutely. Well, brilliant. Thank you very much. And well, by our poll, Nigel Farage might get 30% of our vote if he's going for a non-lockdown strategy. So he'll be someone who's very happy about that. But thank you very much indeed, Liz, for all your thoughts and your insight. It is absolutely invaluable, I think, at this time, and incredibly useful. So thank you once again. And I know it's been an incredibly busy week for you, and you're probably getting harangued with questions from everywhere at the moment, but we very much appreciate that you could spend this hour talking to us about that. As I say, this has been recorded if anyone wants a copy, and we can provide the presentation as well. And questions that haven't been answered, then we will come back to you on those directly. But for now, thank you to you all, and thank you very much to Liz Martin.
If you found this video helpful for your recruitment journey, why not subscribe to our channel? And don't forget to tap the bell to get the latest videos first.